Hey, Michael.
Hi, Bruce. Hello again. Bruce and I have been talking about this sort of thing for 25 years. So hopefully we have our rap down by now. Just a few minutes ago, we were talking about the movie Moonlight.
Yes.
And the Moonlight is an artistic project which was done on a fairly low budget that was not expected to be a blockbuster, and really captured a moment and blew up under circumstances that no one would have expected. And that reminded me a lot of Nevermind.
I would have to agree. Occasionally, creativity is rewarded and can break through the pop infrastructure. It doesn't happen all the time, but I think Moonlight is a great example. I think Kendrick Lamar going to #1 right now and holding that is another great example of how a true artist who's kind of challenging pop convention can break through and actually connect with people.
It's funny though, Kurt Cobain was, the reluctant generational spokesman and all that stuff, and I don't think ever explicitly intended to be that. But I found this quote from Kendrick Lamar. He says, "I always felt like God used me as a vessel." And maybe other people have felt like that and never broke through. But I always thought that, to hit the target, you don't aim at it. And Kurt was not aiming at it, but he just managed to hit it anyway. And there was something about him, I think, that if we're talking about how and why things hit in cultural things hit in a really big way like that, it comes from the people who make it. I don't know if you had this experience. Actually, you should talk about when you first met Kurt. But when I first met Kurt, I was very intimidated. The second before I met him, I was intimidated. The second we said hello, I thought, oh, wow, I know this guy. And the ice broke utterly. He was an utterly familiar person, and I bet he would be familiar to everyone in this audience. And he managed to communicate that through his music, and that was his genius. And that, I think that's what can make something this kind of cultural landmark that we're talking about here. But maybe talk about what happened when you first met Kurt.
Well, the first time I met Kurt, he introduced himself not as a musician, but as a roadie for the Melvins, and his girlfriend was wearing a Melvins t-shirt. And in reflecting on that memory, I've thought it allowed me to kind of think about the steps that it takes to kind of get into popularity, starting with your identity as a superfan. And I think the phrase superfan was used a little bit just in the prior conversation. But that creative tension between the superfan and the indie amateur act is really where a lot of creative tension is. A year after Kurt introduced himself as a roadie for the Melvins, we received a tape from Nirvana, and they started doing some shows around Seattle, and it just went one step at a time.
But that flowing between fan and artist is a big part of what punk rock was about. It was about this egalitarian ideal, this idea that the performer was no better than the audience, and perhaps vice versa. That runs all through all kinds of things, like Mike Watt from the Minutemen told me for a book I wrote called Our Band Could Be Our Life, that when he was growing up, he adored really big rock bands, and he thought that they were like princelings, he called them, people from almost outer space who were different from you and me, who were kind of genetically bred to be rock stars. And that idea was shattered when he saw a punk band in Los Angeles called The Germs. And he realized that I could do this too. So that flowing, what you're talking about, is part of a creative ferment. And that whole indie scene that was nurtured by that punk egalitarian idea, and eventually giving rise to Nirvana.
Yeah, I think one thing we can learn from the Nirvana story is that any artist working in their basement or garage can, through sheer ingenuity and passion and talent, go on to trigger an influence in global culture. And I think at this point in time, for indie artists, those opportunities are greater than ever. In fact, I think if Nirvana was around today, I don't know if they'd even really be working with a record label. They'd probably be crowdfunding for a band. They'd probably be selling merch and downloads through Bandcamp. And there seems to be less reason to align yourself with a label now than ever. Back in the 80s, when I was publishing an indie fanzine, promoting indie music, it was very, very hard for indie artists to get any kind of media attention whatsoever. And as an activist, I really helped kind of turn that around. It's one of the reasons I started Sub Pop Records that went on to sign Nirvana. But I would say at this point in time, if you're an indie artist, stay the course. I think ultimately you'd probably rather get 100% of the revenue from Spotify rather than 15 or 20%.
Another tenet of punk rock, at least from my point of view, is the idea of democratizing media. So rather than waiting to hear your music news from Rolling Stone, you start your own Xerox fanzine. Rather than listening to the big, commercial FM station, you do a college station or maybe even low power FM. Rather than waiting for the next rock superstar act to release their next record, you make your own band and make your own record. And that DIY philosophy came out of punk rock, and punk rock came out of other things. But that whole indie underground that we're talking about from the 80s, in retrospect, looks like maybe a transition or almost like a prototype for what's happening now, where the media is really democratized. Whereas you had indie labels, which were a lot more DIY than a major label. You had these very entrepreneurial, can-do, self-starter people doing their own thing. Now, and they could do this because of various forms of technology. Now the technology is even more powerful. Now your low-power FM station now is, like a webcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Your little Xerox fanzine is a blog. And all these things can be seen and heard all over the planet, wherever there's internet. So what's happening now is just kind of the logical extension via the empowerment of technology from what was happening in the indie punk world.
And Michael, one of the projects I'm involved with right now is a company called 8stem, which is a platform that allows artists and fans to collaborate on music. So artists post a track through our system. You can download it through the 8stem app. Fans can very effortlessly remix, customize, and then share that music. And once again, there's that tension between the artist and the superfan where there's creative engagement. And that's the energy I was feeling in punk clubs in the 80s, seeing Nirvana, seeing a lot of those early groups, was that tension between the superfans who really wanted a more intimate experience with the artists, and then the indie artists themselves.
It's funny, yeah. There's probably no more intimate, aesthetic experience you can have with an artist than actually remixing their music.
Than actually co-creating, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think to me, there's a lot of parallels between the punk indie culture and what 8stem's trying to do, which is again trying to democratize the creative process. And when those mixes are finished, they'll get bumped up to streaming services, and then revenue is going to circle back to the artists. So it's a very artist-centric project. If anybody here has an iPhone, check it out. Number 8stem.
I was thinking about what Nirvana can teach us about music's influence. The theme of our little chat here, and I thought, especially for this crowd, which is more business-oriented crowd, I guess, entrepreneurial people. I thought about something that a French political theorist named Jacques Attali once wrote, and he wrote a book called Noise in the mid-'80s, and he said that music is a herald, and it forecasts changes in culture. And I think Nirvana really did forecast changes in culture. One, it forecast this idea, this changing of the guard, this new demographic shift to Generation X. All of a sudden, these kids who were born, the Generation X kids, were now a cultural, demographic, and consumer force, enough to drive a rock band like from one of their generation up the pop charts. And I actually looked it up on January 11th, 1991. Nirvana was #1 over Garth Brooks, U2, Michael Jackson, Guns N' Roses, Metallica, and Michael Bolton. So that was a real show of generational strength. And after that, there were all those commercials. You know, some kid standing in front of a Hyundai saying, "This car is like punk rock," and all kinds of grunge, Gen X oriented stuff, because they were the new consumer demographic. And Nirvana did forecast that. And I think in the business world, it would literally pay you to pay attention about who is making waves in music and how and what they're saying, because that's going to forecast where things are about to go.
Yeah.
Also, Nirvana's success came out of an independent realm, and that forecast the growth of independent businesses in all kinds of levels, independent publishers, independent film, microbrews, all kinds of things were now indie, and that was the cool thing. And that, again, I'm not saying Nirvana, never mind, specifically kicked that off, but it was a sign, it was a portent that that was going to happen. And so, what can Nirvana teach us about music's influence is just that. Pay attention to what's breaking through in music now, because it's the canary in the coal mine. It's telling you what's coming up soon.
And once again, reflecting on what happened with Nirvana, what people have to realize is it was they were part of a grassroots culture that was doing things on their own and creating their own network that was being ignored by the major media at the time. Rolling Stone didn't even think this culture existed. So when Nirvana broke through to #1, knocking Michael Jackson off the charts, it was like the Berlin Wall falling down. Everybody who had been nurturing this indie community for the past 10 years couldn't believe that one of our acts finally broke through. But that's what happens when you network and you work with communities and you take a more grassroots approach to things. You can work outside of the major systems, and they were just an excellent example of how you stick to your guns and you're authentic, you can break through.
That absolutely can happen, but I'm so curious to hear what you think about the idea that popular music has been, it was getting commodified in 1991, but it's really commodified now, commercialized, micro-demographic. I'm sure a lot of the really big pop music is like focus grouped. It's just incredibly commercial.
Yeah.
How does music break through? How does it become meaningful in the face of that?
Well, it's a great question. I do feel that if you look at the pop charts right now, music seems more formulaic now than at any period that I can remember, with a few exceptions, like Kendrick Lamar, which is really, really inspiring. I feel like right now music is being created by computers for robots. It's that formulaic.
Yeah.
For me personally, it was just such a pleasure to come into New Orleans and hear some of the jazz-influenced music around here. This is a great city for music, and my philosophy has always been revolution start at home. What's going on in your own backyard? And if it's authentic and people are really showing up and it's real, and your community can kind of foster that and nurture that realness, then you're gonna be able to break through the cracks in the system. Again, Kendrick Lamar being a perfect example of that.
I'm also interested in, actually when we first spoke, you were talking about regionality and how that was a real breakthrough. The music business before that was very national. You weren't even mostly sure where bands came from, but now it's like, oh, they're from Seattle, they're from Chicago. That was a new thing, believe it or not. And you use the phrase, soon there will be a pop star in every precinct.
Yes, absolutely. But Michael, you have to remember that it kind of went both ways, and certainly in the 50s and the 60s, we're aware that Muddy Waters came from Chicago, and that Marvin Gaye came from Detroit and so forth. And certain bands came from San Francisco. But something happened in the 70s where things got very commodified, bought out by larger institutions, and that whole notion of regional identity disappeared. And then these new punk artists kind of like reimagined that and tried to underscore the importance of community, regional identity, and labels like Sub Pop coming up out of Seattle, kind of bringing that back into importance.
Yeah, that idea of making something that's regionally powerful into something, national or even internationally powerful was really interesting. Again, I remember you compared that to like soccer teams. People are very tribal about their soccer teams. Even, you may not come from Manchester, but you may be a huge Manchester United fan, and that's your tribe. And I think music can still do that, can define a tribe.
Absolutely. And then conversely, what I see, especially kind of like with the 8-stem app, is you have somebody in Singapore downloading a song that was recorded in New York using stems that were created in New Orleans, and then you're going to have this cross-pollination of different scenes and cultures, and that's going to get really interesting when you have a global community of people kind of like exchanging information at lightning speed.
Yeah, instantaneously. I was really struck, actually, I don't know, maybe 8-9 years ago. I went to Oslo for a music conference, and I looked around, and the hipsters there looked exactly like the hipsters in Williamsburg. And they're like thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
How did that happen? The internet, They could see it right away. Some kid starts wearing a certain type of hairstyle in Williamsburg. This kid in Oslo sees it right away.
We're almost in a place now where we're post-regional identity to an extent, but I think you're going to see a lot more cross-pollination, synthesis of information, and hopefully more creativity, which is really what we're looking for.
But I think also those tribes that we were talking about may not be limited to geographical areas. They may be united by links, through the internet and digital communications rather than just being in the neighborhood. There's also, music seems to be very singles oriented now, kind of like it was when rock and roll started. And at first I was thinking, well, rock and roll, how could music be world changing if it's just based on singles? It's got to be the album. But I mean, Rock Around the Clock, Johnny Be Good, those songs rocked Western culture.
Totally.
You can do it with one
FYI,
song.
with 8-stem, it's all singles. We're not doing any albums. It's interactive music, interactive format, but it's singles oriented. And every week we're releasing more and more singles.
But it's the past is the future right now. It's like it is. I mean, people do buy albums and things like that, but it really is about the single again, and particularly now augmented by video. That kind of blew my mind actually to realize that it really is the song, and people just dribble out songs. They do drop albums, obviously, but a song could change the world, kind of like Smells Like Teen Spirit.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Michael, it was awesome seeing you again.
Yeah.